The boy would not let go of the nursemaid's hand, not even to reach for a fallen leaf, and I stood at the edge of the garden path watching my own son flinch from the wide green world as though it might swallow him whole. "Again, little lord," the nursemaid old Farah coaxed, crouching low. "Just 1 foot, just one." Ro pressed his small face into her skirts instead and would not look up. I had seen him do this 100 times since his mother died. The same retreat, the same fists knotted in fabric, the same refusal to trust his own legs on ground that had once, without warning, gone unsteady beneath the only 2 people who had ever carried him. I was Tobias, king of Sundermoor, and I could command 4 packs to heel with a single word, and I could not make my own son take 1 step toward me. "He is not ready," Farah said, seeing my face. "He will come to it in his own season, your grace." "His season has lasted the better part of a year." "Then it will last a year and a day. You cannot growl a child into walking." I had not meant to growl. I softened my jaw and knelt on the gravel path in my council coat, ruining the knee of it, and held out my hands the way I had every afternoon for weeks. Ro looked at me with his mother's eyes, gray, solemn, far too old for 2 years, and buried himself deeper into Farah's skirts. It was into this small, familiar defeat that Rosamund walked, carrying a basket of linens toward the drying line, and stopped when she saw us there on the path. She did not curtsy too low or apologize for interrupting, the way most of the household did around me. She only stood a moment, basket on her hip, studying the boy's white-knuckled grip on Farah's hand with an attention that had nothing performed in it. "He watches the wrens," she said, not to me exactly, more to the air between us. "Every morning when I hang the wash, he watches them land and doesn't move a muscle until they're gone. Then he claps." "Does he?" I said. "He likes things that come to him, not things he has to go to." She shifted the basket. "Forgive me, your grace." "That was not my place to say." "It was exactly your place," I said, and meant it more than she could have known. She had come to Sundermoor Hall a season past, sent up from the lower village to help with the linens and the kitchen garden after her aunt, who had served here for years, grew too old for the work. I had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with her in all that time. I could not have said, before that afternoon, what color her eyes were. I could have told you after it that they were the brown of good river clay, warm and unhurried, and that she looked at my son the way one looks at something precious and unguarded, not something to be managed. She went on to the drying line. I told myself I watched her go only because a king watches everything in his own garden. I had built Sundermoor into a kingdom that ran on discipline, the way a man builds a dam when he has seen what a river can do unchecked. My father had ruled with his temper first and his sense second, and I had spent my boyhood learning every hard lesson of what that cost a household. When the crown passed to me, I had sworn, privately, that I would rule the opposite way, steady, deliberate, a man whose word could be set a clock by. It had made me, by most accounts, a good king. It had also made me, in the 2 years since Alara's death, a man who mistook stillness for peace, and who had very nearly convinced himself the two were the same thing. My council did not yet know what to make of the small disturbances that had begun creeping into that stillness. Lord Aldysvarn, my steward and the closest thing I had to an old friend since boyhood, cornered me in the map room not 3 days after the rain and the wordless song, ostensibly to discuss the autumn grain counts, and instead stood turning a piece of chalk over in his fingers with the particular caution of a man about to say something he has rehearsed. "The boy is laughing again," he said. "The whole kitchen heard him yesterday. Farah says it is the linen woman's doing." "Farah says a great many things." "Farah is rarely wrong about children, Tobias. She raised you, if you'll recall, and you turned out at least tolerable." He set the chalk down. "I only say this because the pack will notice what the kitchen has already noticed, and the pack will ask questions faster than you'll like. A widowed king. A servant girl the boy has taken to. You know how such stories get told before anyone has bothered to ask you what is true. Then let them ask me, I said, and I will tell them the truth when I know it myself. He studied me a moment longer than was comfortable, the way old friends do when they see something in your face you have not yet said aloud even to yourself. That is the first time in 2 years you have answered me instead of the crown, he said, and left it there, and left the room, and did not raise the matter again for some while, though I caught him watching me across the hall more than once with an expression that was not quite worry and not quite hope, but something balanced carefully between the two. That night I did not sleep well, which was not new. I had not slept well since Alara died birthing our son, 2 winters back, in a room down the corridor from the one I now lay awake in. I had built a wall in myself in that time, brick by careful brick, and I had believed it finished. I lay in the dark and found, to my own irritation, that I was remembering the exact plainness of Rosamund's voice. No flattery in it, no fear, just a woman telling her king a true thing about his son, because the true thing mattered more than the telling of it. I told myself this meant nothing. Kings notice many things. It is the nature of ruling to notice. I told myself this for 3 more days, and each of those days I found some errand that took me past the drying line, or the kitchen garden, or the low stone wall where she sat sometimes shelling peas into her apron with Ro watching from Farah's arms a few feet off, never approaching, only watching, the way he watched the wrens. On the 4th day it rained, and the boy would not be soothed. He had never taken to storms. The shudder of thunder against the windows sent him rigid and silent in a way that frightened me more than crying would have. Farah walked him up and down the nursery for an hour. I stood in the doorway, useless in my own house, until Rosamund appeared with a fresh kettle for the nurse's tea and paused at the sight of him. She did not rush to take him. She sat instead at a small distance on the nursery floor itself in her work skirts and began to hum something low and wordless, some old tune with no proper shape to it, the kind a woman hums to herself while working rather than performs for an audience. She did not look at Ro while she did it. She looked at her own hands. It took the length of 3 verses. Then the boy turned his head from Farah's shoulder, watched her, and by the 4th verse had gone slack and quiet in the nurse's arms, lulled not by attention paid to him, but by the simple, unhurried fact of a person nearby who wanted nothing from him. "Where did you learn that?" I asked her, once Farah had laid him in his cot. "My mother sang it. It isn't a real song, just noise with a shape." She flushed, realizing how long she had stayed, and rose too quickly, smoothing her apron. "I should go down, the kettle." "Rosamund." She stopped at the door, my son's name for her already, though I had not yet asked it of her, sitting strange and correct in my mouth as though I had said it 100 times before and merely forgotten the sound of it until now. "Thank you," I said, which was not at all what I had meant to say, and was, somehow, entirely what needed saying. She dipped her head and went, and I stood over my sleeping son and felt something in my chest do a thing I had no ready word for, not a surge, not a pull, nothing so simple as those. It was more like a held breath finally let out in a room I had not known was airless until that moment. I put my hand flat against the doorframe and stood there long enough that Farah asked, gently, if I required anything. I required nothing. I required everything. I said neither and went to walk the wall until the ache of it settled into something I could carry. Word travels fast in a small household, and faster in a wolf pack's hall, where every servant carries a portion of the old blood and a nose for what the rest of us pretend not to smell. Within the week, I heard 2 of the kitchen girls whispering by the larder that the new linen woman had a gentleness to her that the little lord had taken to like no one since his mother, and that it was a pity, wasn't it, a plain pity, that such things could never come to anything, given what she was and what I was. I did not correct them. I did not yet know myself what I believed could or could not come to anything. I only knew that I found reasons, increasingly poor ones, to be in the garden when she was. I learned, in small pieces gathered the way one gathers windfall fruit, without asking outright, and without ever quite admitting I was gathering anything, that Rosamund had lost her own mother young, and had kept a widowed father's house through her girlhood before he too passed, and that she had come to Sundermore not out of any grand design, but because her aunt's failing hands had needed replacing, and because, as she said once to Farah within my hearing, a woman ought to be useful somewhere in the world. And this was the somewhere that had offered itself. There was no ambition in her that I could find, however I looked for it, and I confess I looked, half hoping to find some, because ambition would have been simple to understand and simple to guard against. What I found instead was only steadiness, the same steadiness with which she folded linens too fine for her own bed, or knelt in the dirt of the kitchen garden coaxing herbs that had no business surviving Sundermore's short summers, or sat with my son and asked nothing of him but that he be, for an hour, unafraid. I began, without deciding to, comparing her against the memory of Ilara, and caught myself at it, ashamed, more than once. Ilara had been quick and bright and full of a kind of restless fire that had drawn me to her when we were both young enough to think fire was the only thing worth building a life around. I had loved her without reservation, and I grieved her still, some mornings, with a rawness that surprised me even now. But fire, I had come to understand in the 2 years since, needs constant feeding, and a house can grow very tired holding its breath against a wind that might put it out. Rosamund was no fire. She was closer to what the old stories called hearth warmth, the kind that does not flare and does not have to be watched every hour for fear it will consume the room, only tended, gently, and trusted to hold. I did not say any of this to anyone. I barely allowed myself to think it in full sentences. But I noticed, and the noticing itself felt like a kind of quiet treason against the wall I had built, brick by careful brick, in the 2 years since I had buried my queen. The turn came on an ordinary afternoon in high summer, the kind with no weather in it worth remarking, warm and gold and slow. I had come out to the garden with letters I did not read, sat on the bench beneath the old plane tree, and let myself simply watch my son attempt, for the 100th time, to be coaxed onto his feet. Farah held both his hands this time, walking backward slowly across the grass, murmuring encouragement. Ro's legs wobbled under him, more habit than weakness by now, I suspected, though no physician had ever said so outright. A few steps in, he stopped, as he always stopped, and folded down to sit rather than risk the next one. Rosamund was near the roses at the garden's far edge, gathering the spent blooms into her apron before they could seed where they oughtn't, her back half to us. She was not performing patience for the boy's benefit. She was simply working, the way she always simply worked, as though the world's most urgent business was the honest business directly in front of her hands. I do not know what changed in Ro in that exact moment. I have turned it over every night since and found no better answer than this: that children, like wolves, know true north when they feel it, long before they have words to explain the pull of it. He let go of Farah's hands. Not let go, deliberate as a small soldier laying down arms he no longer needed. Farah froze, afraid to move and break whatever had seized him. And my son, who had not taken 3 steps together unaided in the whole of his short life, turned his body away from both of us and started, wobbling, arms out for balance, straight across the grass toward the woman at the roses. Ro Farah breathed, not daring louder than a breath. He did not look back at either of us. He did not reach for the nearest hand, though mine was nearer than anyone's, though I was already half out of my seat with letters spilling unheeded to the ground. He went past me, 4 steps, 5, unsteady as a new colt, arms pinwheeling, and on the 6th he pitched forward with the particular fearless faith of a child who has decided, in whatever wordless country children decide such things, that he will be caught. Rosamund turned at the sound of the grass and dropped her apron of petals to the ground and opened her arms exactly in time. He landed against her with a small, delighted grunt, both fists closing in her skirts, and laughed, a sound I had heard perhaps 4 times since his mother died, and Rosamund went utterly still with him in her arms, the way a person goes still when they understand, all in one breath, that they have just been given something too large for the moment to hold. I do not have better words for what happened in me at that exact instant than this. It was as though every door I had quietly nailed shut in that house, in myself, swung open at once, without violence, without splintering, simply opened, because they had never truly been built to stay closed against her. There was no howl in it, no surge. It felt instead like the first note of the old wordless song she hummed. Arriving finally at the one note the whole tune had been walking toward all along, and everything in me recognizing the sound of home before I had even understood it was a song. I stood in the grass with my letters forgotten and understood, with a certainty that went down into the marrow the pack elders spoke of when they spoke of the old bonds, that my son had simply seen, plainly and without the burden of a grown man's caution, what I had spent weeks refusing to let myself see in full daylight. Farah recovered first, pressing a hand to her mouth, eyes bright. "He walked," she said, wondering, as though she needed to say it aloud to trust it. "Your Grace, he walked." "I saw," I said. My voice did not sound entirely like my own. Rosamund knelt fully into the grass now, gathering row properly against her, and looked up at me over the crown of his head, with an expression caught between joy and alarm, as though she feared she had overstepped some line simply by existing in the place my son had chosen to run to. "I didn't call him," she said quickly. "Your Grace, I promise you I never once." "I know," I said, and crossed the grass myself, slower, steadier, and knelt down across from her so that the 3 of us made some small, strange, unplanned triangle in the sunlit grass, my son the warm center of it. "I was watching the whole while. You did nothing but stand where you always stand, and be exactly who you always are." Her breath caught at that, some understanding moving behind her eyes that she was not yet ready to name aloud, any more than I was fully ready to name it myself. "He has never taken more than one step without a hand to hold," I said. "Not for me, not for his own nurse who has loved him since the hour of his birth." "Perhaps he simply chose this day," she said, careful, as though offering me an easier truth than the one sitting between us. "Perhaps," I said, "or perhaps a boy who has been too frightened to trust the ground beneath him finally found someone he trusted more than his own fear of falling. I do not think that is nothing, Rosamund. I do not think that can be explained away as a Tuesday afternoon and good weather." She looked down at Ro, who had settled into her lap as though it were a chair built specially to his measure, one small hand still fisted possessively in her skirts, already half drowsing in the drunk, sudden exhaustion of a child who has just done something enormous. "I have only ever wanted him to be well," she said quietly. "That is all it was on my end, Your Grace. I swear it." "I know that too," I said. "That is precisely why it happened the way it happened. He did not walk toward the nearest hand. He walked past his own father to find the one person in this garden who wanted nothing back from him. That is not chance, Rosamund. Among my people, that is the oldest sign we have, that the ones who cannot yet lie to themselves, the very young, the very old, the wolves who run on instinct alone, can see a bond before the grown and guarded among us will let ourselves believe in it." She went very still, understanding arriving now in full. "You are telling me this is more than a boy learning to walk. I am telling you that I have watched you for weeks and called it kindness, and called it gratitude, and called it a dozen smaller names, because they were easier to hold than the true one. I am telling you my son simply had the courage to walk toward what I have been standing still in front of, too cautious to cross the grass myself." A breeze went through the plane tree above us, scattering a little late summer light across the 3 of us, across Ro's dark hair and her clay-brown eyes gone wide and careful, weighing what I had said against what her own life had taught her to expect from kings. "I am a linen woman," she said, not bitterly, only plainly, the same plainness with which she'd once told me about wrens. "I came here to fold sheets and mend hems. I did not come here to be told such things by the King of Sundermore." "No," I agreed, "you came here to fold sheets. And instead you taught a frightened boy that the ground could hold him, simply by being someone worth walking toward. I do not think either of us can call that ordinary anymore, whatever else it is called." She was quiet a long moment, her hand moving without thinking through Rose's hair in the same unhurried rhythm as her humming, and I let the quiet sit, because I understood, watching her, that whatever she decided next could not be hurried into being by a king's wanting, only offered room enough to arrive on its own 2 feet, the way my son just had. "I do not know what I am meant to say to that," she admitted finally. "You are not meant to say anything today," I said. "Today you are only meant to know that I saw it, and that I will not pretend, going forward, that I did not. I have spent 2 years building a very careful, very quiet life around the shape of what I lost. I did not expect a boy's first steps to walk straight through the middle of it, but they did, and I find I am not sorry." Something eased in her shoulders at that, not agreement yet, but the first loosening of a woman bracing for a demand that had, instead, turned out to be an offering. "He'll want telling this as a story someday," she said softly, glancing down at the sleeping weight in her lap. "His first steps." "Then we had better make sure it is a good one," I said, and for the first time in longer than I could easily count, I felt something in my chest settle rather than ache, quiet, sure, patient as a held note waiting for the rest of the song to catch up to it. She smiled then, small and real, the first one she had ever let me see fully, not the polite bend of the mouth she gave a king but an actual smile, surprised out of her by the day itself. "Then we had better start with the part where he let go of Farah's hands," she said, "and not the part where he fell so terribly far to reach me." 6 steps, I said, hardly far. It felt far watching him. It felt far to me too, I admitted, and I was not the one he was walking toward. Farah, who had been standing this whole while with the tactful stillness of a woman, who has served 3 generations of a family and knows precisely when her presence is a kindness, and when it is an intrusion, cleared her throat gently. "Shall I take him up for his nap, Your Grace, or—" "Let him sleep where he is a moment longer," I said, and Rosamund's arms tightened just slightly around the boy, an answer of her own given before she had words ready for the larger question still sitting unclaimed in the grass between us. I did not press her that day, or the next, for more than she had already, wordlessly, given. I understood something of patience by then, 2 years of it having taught me most of what I knew. But I made certain, in the weeks that followed, that the garden bench beneath the plane tree was mended where it had gone soft with rot, and that a second chair appeared beside it without explanation, and that when Roe took his hesitant, determined, ever surer steps across the lawn each afternoon, there were, increasingly, 2 sets of arms waiting rather than one, his father's and hers, close enough together now that the boy no longer had to choose between them, only to walk toward the warmth that had somehow, without proclamation or ceremony, become one thing instead of 2. The Sundermore harvest gathering fell that year in the last warm week of September, when the whole pack came up from the lower village, and the tenant farms to fill the hall with long tables and louder voices than the house usually held. It was tradition older than my father's father, a night of thanks to whatever old gods the wolves of this valley had first bowed to, before crowns and councils, when a pack was only a den and a fire, and the certainty that the ones beside you would not let you starve. I had dreaded it every year since Alara died, that particular loneliness of standing at the head of a long table full of paired hands and murmured affections, a king toasted by everyone and truly seen by no one. This year Farah brought Roe down for the first hour, as she always did, dressed in his small blue coat, and set him on my knee at the high table, and I watched him twist and crane over my shoulder, restless, searching the crowd the way he had once searched only for Farah's face and now searched, unmistakably, for one face in particular. Rosamund had not been seated at the high table. She would not have expected it, and had taken a place instead near the far hearth with the other household women, modest and correct in a dress the deep green of holly leaves, her hair bound simply back. But my son found her across that entire crowded hall in under a minute, the way a compass finds north whether or not anyone has asked it to, and squirmed so insistently that I had no choice, king or not, but to carry him down the length of my own hall to set him in her lap instead. "Your Grace," she said, half rising, flustered, the whole nearby table falling into the particular hush that follows a king wherever he walks. "Sit," I said. He would have had the whole hall in an uproar otherwise. "You would be doing me a mercy." She sat and settled him, and within a breath he was contentedly plucking at the ribbon in her hair, and the tension in the nearby faces eased into something softer, something that looked, if I was not mistaken, like relief on the pack's behalf as much as mine, as though they too had been waiting, without quite letting themselves hope for it, to see their king's son settled and glad in someone's arms again. I did not return to the high table at once. I stood a moment longer than protocol required, watching the firelight move over both their faces, and felt old Aldous Varn's eyes on me from across the hall, and did not care, for once, what conclusions he was drawing. It was Rosamund herself who grew uneasy in the days that followed, not I. I found her late one afternoon sitting alone on the low stone wall by the kitchen garden, her hands still, which was unlike her. I had never once seen her sit with idle hands. "The women were talking this morning," she said, before I had asked anything. "About the gathering, about how the little lord climbed into my lap in front of the whole hall, and how you stood there and let him, and did not seem to mind it." "I did not mind it." "They are saying things, Your Grace, kind things mostly, but things all the same, that a king does not carry his son across a crowded hall for just anyone." She looked up at me, and there was real trouble in her face now, not shyness but something closer to fear. "I am a linen woman. I fold your sheets and mend your son's little coats. If I let myself believe what everyone seems so eager for me to believe, and I am wrong, I will have to go on folding your sheets afterward with that wrongness sitting in the room with me every day for the rest of my life. I would rather not hope at all than hope wrongly in a house I cannot leave." It was the most words she had ever said to me at once, and the most afraid I had heard her, and I understood, hearing it, that I had been so busy discovering my own certainty in the garden that I had not stopped to consider how differently the ground looked from where she stood. A woman with far less power than I had to walk away from a mistake, and far more to lose if the great households closed ranks against her for daring to be chosen by a king's heart instead of merely his son's. "Then let me be plain, so there is no wrongness left for you to fear," I said, and sat beside her on the wall, careful to leave space enough that she would not feel crowded into anything. "I am not offering you a kindness I might withdraw when it becomes inconvenient. I do not know yet what shape this will take, or how quickly, or what the elders will say when I bring it before them formally, as I intend to. But I know that what I feel when I am near you is not the passing fondness of a lonely man for the first gentle face he has noticed in 2 years of grief. It is steadier than that. It has been steady since before I let myself name it. And I would rather tell you that plainly today on this wall, and risk you thinking me forward, than let you spend one more week folding my sheets while frightened of your own hope." She was quiet a long while, looking down at her hands, and when she finally spoke her voice had lost its fear, though not its caution. "That is a great deal to be told on a garden wall on an ordinary Thursday." "There has not been an ordinary Thursday in this house since your first afternoon here," I said. "I only noticed it later than I should have." She almost smiled at that, the caution in her easing by some small, visible measure, though she did not yet let herself lean into whatever came next. "I will need more than one Thursday to trust it," she said. Then you shall have as many Thursdays as you require, I said. I find I am no longer in any hurry at all. I did bring the matter before my counsel, as I had promised her I would, though not before I had thought carefully on how to do it in a way that protected her from the worst of what old men in fine coats can do to a quiet woman's name when they believe they are only being prudent. I called them not to the council chamber, with its long cold table and its echo built for arguments, but to my own private study, where the fire was small, and the room held only 4 men besides myself, Aldous Varn, and old Lord Brennick who had served my father before me, and the pack's 2 eldest elders, keepers of the bond lore that predated every crown Sundermore had ever set on a mortal head. I told them plainly what I had seen in the garden, the boy letting go of 2 steady hands to walk unaided toward a woman who had asked nothing of him. And I told them what I had felt in my own chest in that moment, without dressing it in softer language than it deserved. Brennick, who I had expected to object first and loudest, only sat back in his chair and studied the fire a long moment before he spoke. I watched your grandmother do the very same thing, he said. Not with a child, with hounds. She used to say the young and the untrained see plainer than the rest of us, because they have not yet learned to talk themselves out of what is true in front of their own eyes. If your son ran to her, and only to her, out of every soul in that garden, I would not call that a small thing, your grace. I would call it the plainest evidence a bond ever gives. The elder called Mother Sale, eldest of the pack's old blood and the last living voice who could recite the founding oaths of Sundermore from memory, asked only one question. Does she want him? Not the crown. Not you, if you'll forgive me for separating the two. Does she want the boy for his own sake, the way a mother wants a child that is not yet legally hers to want? She wanted him well before she ever knew what I felt for her, I said. She wanted him well before she let herself hope for anything at all in return. Then the rest is only paperwork and a wedding feast, Sale said, and I am old enough that I intend to enjoy both thoroughly. Aldous Varn, who had known me longest and had watched me most closely these past months, said nothing at all for a long moment, and then rose and crossed the room and gripped my shoulder the way he had not done since we were boys sparring in the training yard before either of us had crowns or councils to answer to. I am glad, he said simply, that you finally answered as a man again, and not only as a king. It was, from Aldous, as close to sentiment as I had ever heard him come, and I did not tease him for it, because I understood, better than I once had, how rare and costly such plain feeling could be to offer aloud. There remained only the matter of telling Rosamund that the elders had not merely permitted the bond, but had, in their own gruff and ancient fashion, welcomed it, and of telling her in a way that let her arrive at her own certainty rather than simply inheriting mine. I found her, some days later, in the kitchen garden at dusk, kneeling among the last of the season's herbs, and I did not announce myself with any grand speech. I only knelt beside her in the dirt, ruining a second coat that autumn, and began, without preamble, pulling weeds from the row she was working, badly, in the way of a man who has commanded armies but never once tended a garden bed. She laughed at me before she could stop herself, an unguarded sound, the twin of her son's laughter in the grass, and I understood in that moment how much I had come to treasure the exact shape of it. You are pulling out the mint, she said. The mint is meant to be there. Then teach me, I said, which is which. I find I would like to learn. She looked at me sideways, some new understanding moving behind her clay-brown eyes, and set down her trowel. You did not come out here at dusk, in your good coat, to learn the difference between mint and weed, your grace. No, I admitted. I came to tell you that I have spoken with my council, and with the pack elders, and that not one of them raised an objection to what I told them I intend to do, which is to ask you, when you are ready and not one day before, to be Ro's mother in truth as well as in the way he has already claimed you, and to be my wife, and to be whatever Sundermore calls its queens now that I have finally found one worth calling by that name again. She sat very still in the dirt, her hands loose in her lap, and for a long moment said nothing at all, and I let the silence hold, because I had learned by then that the things worth having in this life rarely arrived quickly, and were rarely worse for the waiting. "I do not come from anything grand," she said finally quietly. "I want you to have said that plainly to your elders before I answer you. Not a lord's daughter, not even a huntsman's. My father mended fences for a living, and taught me to read from a single borrowed book he never had to return because its owner died before he could ask for it back." "I told them exactly that," I said. "Lord Brennick said it reminded him of my grandmother, who, I am told, terrified 3 kingdoms and could not read a word until she was 20, and taught herself out of stubbornness alone. Mother Sale asked only whether you loved my son for his own sake, and not for what standing beside him might buy you, and when I told her the truth of that, she said the rest was paperwork." Rosamund's eyes had gone bright in the last of the dusk light, and she pressed the back of one dirt-streaked hand briefly to her mouth, the way a person does when they are trying to hold a feeling steady long enough to trust it. "And what do you say," she asked, "when it is only you asking, and not your council, and not your elders, and not even your son, who has already made his own choice plainer than either of us managed to for months? I say that I have buried one wife, and grieved her honestly, and built a very careful, very quiet life around the shape of what that grief left behind, believing it was the only life left available to me. I say that a boy who was too frightened to trust his own 2 legs found the courage to walk straight past his own father, because he trusted you more than he trusted his fear, and that watching him do it taught me something I had spent 2 years refusing to learn on my own account. I say that I do not want a careful life anymore, Rosamund. I want an ordinary Thursday with you in it, for the rest of however many Thursdays I am given." She laughed again, wetly this time, half a sob folded into the sound of it, and reached out and took my dirt-stained hand in her own dirt-stained hand there among the ruined mint, and said only, "Then you had better stop pulling up my herbs, your grace, if you mean to keep me in this garden for the rest of your Thursdays," which was not quite a yes and was entirely a yes, and I understood it exactly as she meant it. Winter came between the promise and the wedding, as winters will, and I confess I had feared it, feared that the long dark months, with their short light and their slow days, might give her too much room to talk herself back out of a hope so newly and carefully built. Instead, I found the opposite proved true. Snowbound afternoons in the nursery, with row-building towers of carved blocks at her feet and the fire cracking low in the grate, seemed only to settle the thing further into place, the way a house settles more soundly into its foundation with each hard season it survives. She taught me, that winter, the small, ordinary architecture of a life I had forgotten how to want, how to sit still long enough to hear a child's entire invented story about a carved wooden fox without once glancing toward the door, how to laugh at my own clumsiness with a needle when she set me to mending a torn hem rather than summoning a servant to do it, how to be simply a man in a warm room rather than a king holding vigil over his own grief. I did not know, until she showed me, how much of ruling I had let stand in for living. By the time the first thaw came, there was no one left in Sundermore Hall, from the newest kitchen girl to old Lord Brennick himself, who did not already understand what the spring would bring. Even the Pax message runners, sent out through the valley on ordinary business, carried the news along without my ever having formally announced it, the way true things travel fastest when no one has to be told to believe them. We were married in Sundermore's old hall the following spring, when the plane tree in the garden had gone thick with new leaf, and the roses she tended had come back fuller than any gardener before her had ever managed to coax from that stubborn soil. It was a modest ceremony, at her own quiet insistence, though the whole valley came regardless, spilling out past the hall doors into the garden itself, because a pack that has waited 2 years to see its king glad again will not be kept from witnessing the day he finally is. Rose stood between us at the center of it all. In a small new coat Rosamund had sewn herself rather than trust to the tailors, steady now on legs that had once refused to carry him 3 steps unaided. And when the old rites were spoken, and the moment came for him to be presented formally as the pack's young lord before his new mother, he did not need coaxing, and he did not need a hand to hold. He simply crossed the small distance between us on his own 2 sure feet, the way he had first crossed the summer grass to find her, and put one hand in mine and the other in hers, joining the 2 of us together with the same unhesitating instinct that had first shown me, in the garden, what I had been too cautious to see on my own. It was Farah, in the end, who said aloud what none of the rest of us yet dared, watching Ro totter between us one gold October afternoon many months before that wedding day, laughing at nothing, sure now on his own 2 feet in a way that still made my chest ache with a gladness I had thought I'd buried with his mother. "He doesn't run to either of you any more," she said, folding a small blanket over her arm, smiling at the sight of him. "He only runs to the middle." I looked at Rosamund across the space where our son stood wobbling and pleased with himself in the last of the summer light, and she looked back at me, and neither of us said anything at all, because for once there was nothing left that needed saying out loud, only a small boy laughing between us, exactly where he had always meant to stand.